So normally this is the loudness around this for the speakers. I think this is enough. More is not allowed, sorry.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome very much to this morning event on the use of bioenergy. The title of our event is Unlocking Net Zero Through Investment in Sustainable Bioenergy and BECCS. And if you're puzzled about the word BECCS, it means bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. So capturing the carbon emissions from a bioenergy plant and storing it underneath to reduce the CO2 level in the atmosphere. Let me shortly introduce myself. My name is Christian Rakosch. I am the president of the World Bioenergy Association, and we are hosting this event today. And we're very glad to have a very distinguished panel of speakers here that will discuss the role of bioenergy for managing the gap that we are seeing, an increasing gap actually between the ambition to reduce CO2 emissions and the factual emissions that are here. We believe bioenergy can play an important role in bringing down this gap, and it has a very specific role because it is the only technology that can actually lower the CO2 emissions in the atmosphere, and that we're afraid will play an increasingly important role in the future because we're definitely overshooting the CO2 emissions for the time being. We want to discuss how this can be done, how this can be scaled, and how we can make sure that sustainability is at all times in the center of our attention and maintained. Let me first shortly introduce our distinguished speakers here, starting with the Right Honourable Amber Rudd. She has been former UK Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change. John Keppler, he's the Chief Executive Officer of Enviva, the largest producer of wood pellets for energy use in the world. And Will Gardiner from Drax, who is currently engaging in the largest project on bioenergy, carbon capture and storage in the world. So very dedicated professionals here. And let me start with introducing Amber Rudd more closely to you. As mentioned, she has been UK Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change. After a career in business, Amber Rudd became the Member of Parliament for Hastings and Rye from 2010 to 2019. She was appointed Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change in 2015 and led the UK delegation to the successful completion of the Paris Climate Agreement. Amber went on to serve as Home Secretary, as Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, and also served as Minister for Women and Equalities. Since leaving government, she has taken on engagements in current affairs, global events, the climate change emergency and security issues. Mrs. Rudd, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christian, and it's a great pleasure to be here to talk about a kind of Cinderella, I feel sometimes, of the energy mix. There's so much excitement going on here today in Glasgow, but it's great just to pause and think about what our mix is, where it's coming from, and just to take a closer, perhaps, which I think we'll have the opportunity to do, deep dive as to what the developments are there. And it's great to do that, particularly when we're thinking today about gender, but also about science. And science is such an important part of trying to make sure that we reach these ambitious targets to reduce carbon emissions. Christian, you referred to my parliamentary career, my ministerial career, and I'm reminded that when I was made Secretary of State by David Cameron, it's always quite a frenetic moment, those reshuffles. My children used to call it football transfer day, as everyone rushes in and rushes out. And I rushed in, was sat down, and was very honourably and kindly given the opportunity to be Secretary of State of Energy and Climate Change. And the Prime Minister said, keep the lights on, keep the bills down, and get me a deal in Paris. And I nodded sagely and then went out to think about quite how complicated that request was. The so-called trilemma about making sure that we kept the public with us, keep the bills down, had absolute energy security of supply and decarbonised at the same time. And all the time, those three things come into some conflict one way or the other. And sometimes, I hate to tell you this, Christian, politicians are not always straightforward with the public. But now I'm no longer a politician, I can perhaps be a little bit more upfront about that. But there are certain costs which come and go. But the bigger prize, as we know, is decarbonising our electricity, our industry, our world, so that we avoid the terrible consequences that we're otherwise going to see. In Paris, the focus was on energy. And all the people attending there were a lot of the energy suppliers, a lot of the energy journalists. And I note that here, there's much more emphasis on money, on finance. Because really what we had in Paris was a successful outcome, which was a pledge, a major pledge from 195 countries to try to decarbonize through their own mechanisms, using their own NDCs. And now, 6 years later, what we're looking about is delivery. And that's why the emphasis, quite rightly, has to be on money, how we're going to pay for it, which are the ones that need government support, which are the ones that don't, and how ultimately we make sure that our entire power supply changes. So in terms of the differences between Paris and Glasgow, I think there's a lot to be positive about. There's always a lot of criticism about pledges, because easy to make a pledge, less easy to actually deliver it. But in the 6 years from Paris to Glasgow, we have seen a lot of policies put in place that will be able to help with deliver that. And I think that what the money is looking for more than anything from Glasgow now is certainty, so that they can really put the investment in place that is necessary to build that green industrial revolution. Because we shouldn't try to downplay what we're doing. We're trying to do something extraordinary to change our whole power system for everybody, not just here in the UK or in Europe, but wider than that in the whole of the world. And we know that there are strains in that for good reason. How do less developed countries industrialize without using the sort of carbon emission techniques that we used? And hopefully all those negotiations going on around us will help to deliver that. So bioenergy is 11% of the world's energy. And I thought before I tried to announce what it was in the UK, I would just check on the ESO. I don't know whether anybody else carries that app on their phone. And it goes up and down. And I find it's always surprisingly large, although I asked Will earlier, and he thought it was twice as much as it actually was. Sorry, Will, to rat on you like that publicly. But the country's energy mix today is 46% gas, 24% wind, 16% nuclear, 6% biomass, 4% imports, 2% water, and 1% solar. And what you didn't hear there was coal. And that really is one of the great triumphs, I think, of the past 6 years, that I haven't read out any coal. And it is my view that that would be impossible to do without Drax's participation, without bioenergy in general. And really, I think that that is the theme that I would love us to hopefully, with your help, Christian, explore today, is given that we want renewables, given that we want a zero carbon future, how do we deliver what David Cameron called keeping the lights on? How do we deliver that essential base load? And I think that bioenergy has an absolutely critical part to play in that. So I hope that we can learn more today about how that can be delivered and the opportunities that are there, I hope, for investment, but also how science can help make sure that that's a success. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amber. You just said it's something extraordinary that we are up to, and I fully agree. And the two gentlemen to your left, they are two guys that have actually managed the extraordinary. And I will start with introducing John Keppler to you. He's the co-founder and the chairman and chief executive officer of Enviva. Over the past decade, John has been responsible for setting Enviva's strategic direction and leading the company's growth from a startup company. It was a startup company 10 years ago to become the world's largest producer of woody biomass fuels with operations in several states of the US Southeast, with 10 running pellet plants with a production capacity of 6.5 million tons and 6 ports in the US Southeast to ship these pellets to their different destinations. Enviva is sourcing a fuel that is replacing coal and other fossil fuels to generate electricity and heat in industrial plants mainly. And it is complying with strict sustainability standards that are certified by third parties. Mr. Keppler led Enviva Partners to its initial public offering on the New York Stock Exchange in 2015, making it the first publicly traded company in the industry. John, the floor is yours.
Well, Christian, thank you very much. Amber as well. You are both COP veterans, and I'm very much the rookie. But what I will tell you, it's been amazing even in the short time that I've been here. We are looking at a global problem, and with that, we need a global solution, and in our case, it is a global supply chain. Amber, the quotes this morning are remarkable, and I think that both you and Will have made tremendous strides in ensuring the UK's transition away from coal. What I would point out, though, is that the leading generating source that you cited today still is gas. And so the challenge ahead, even for nations like the United Kingdom, which has done such a remarkable job of beginning that decarbonization effort in the energy transition, is not just eliminate coal, but keep gas in the ground. Right? Our job, if we are to satisfy the goal ahead, is to make sure that we keep carbon in the ground. Right? Keep carbon in the ground. That is no small task, right? We're actually going in the wrong direction right now. Right? Coal usage is up 10-15%, not just in Europe, but around the world. Electricity is returned to demand levels pre-pandemic, and the generating mix is not as favorable as anyone would like. And so when you hear, and certainly what I have heard resoundingly in my few days at COP is code red for the environment, code red for climate. Those are really direct and profound statements. But when we think about what that means, the question is, does it have to be that way? And what I think we can all share, certainly from our perspective, is no. No, it does not have to be that way. And so against the refrain of code red for climate, that the idea that 1.5 degrees Celsius will live or die in the next 10 years, that same can be said for net zero. The decisions that we are going to make in the next few years will dictate the course of climate. And we had an earlier day on adaptation. Today it's about science and gender and the remarkable advances that our colleagues will share on BECCS. But the reality is that we have a solution today in force solving so much of this difficult problem. Why is it a difficult problem? Because the world demands electricity on demand. And running an electricity grid it's actually really hard. It's actually really, really hard. Synchronous generation on demand, that's hard. That's hard. Grid balancing, energy security, those are really, really hard things. Impossible? No. But there's a reason why baseload generation has been provided on the basis of fossil fuels for a very, very long time. Because it's a fuel that is transportable, it's accessible, and as Amber said, it oftentimes meets the cost equation, not just the durability. So how do you break that model? Well, what we and a number of folks came to the fore some time ago, which was if we could manufacture a drop-in substitute for coal, could we make a meaningful dent in the climate implications of fossil fuel fired generation? And the answer, of course, is yes. And the UK has demonstrated it as well as or better than any country in the entire world, where today biomass generation displaces somewhere between 80 and 85% of the equivalent life cycle emissions of a similarly fired coal station. And Will can share the remarkable success that Drax has had on that. Incidentally, it's about 70% compared to gas. And so the promise and the potential is remarkable, because displacing baseload, dispatchable power and heat is hard. Europe today uses about 60% of its renewable energies on the basis of biomass and bioenergy. So the market has emerged quite phenomenally around this substitution. Doing it sustainably is the heart of our business. We displace coal and we grow more trees. That's how we fight climate change. The path ahead requires not just innovation and expansion of the market. You know, when we founded the company and were able to grow this, the Kyoto Protocol wasn't even in force. Red 1 had not yet come into binding obligations. But we had a vision and an execution plan. And now the world is saying not just double down, but if you listen to the IEA's recent report, we need to triple down. We need to triple down on the utilization of bioenergy, the way that the UK has done, the way that we have done, and the supplies that we deliver around the world. Again, it's a global problem, and a global supply chain will provide a solution to that problem. But what does doubling or tripling even mean? It means that we need to extend the gains that we've made, not only in elimination of fossils in power generation, but also in the very difficult to decarbonize, very difficult to abate industries like cement, steel, lime, aviation fuels. That's the technology path that this industry is on. Not only facilitating the energy transition, being a critical part in eliminating fossil fuel-fired emissions, but looking at those deep, deep, deep decarbonization efforts that society requires if we are going to mitigate the implications of climate change and keep this world to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius. How we do that and how we do that together, engaging all of our stakeholders around the world, that's how we're going to ensure a sustainable future. But we should be clear, the challenge is big. We can't, and Amber, I appreciate you saying this as well, we can't pledge our way to net zero. We can't science paper our way out of climate change. To mitigate the effects of climate change requires action, decisions, choices, and industry is a critical part of that. And we are very, very proud of the role that Enviva plays as one of the largest supply chain partners in the world, delivering this renewable solution. And I look forward to continuing our conversation this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. You can indeed be proud of what you have been achieving together with Enviva. I think so can Will with the pathway that Drax has been going from the biggest coal power station to the biggest generator of renewable energy in the UK. Will, you have joined Drax in 2015 as Chief Financial Officer, and you were appointed as Chief Executive Officer in January 2018. Will has a wealth of experience in finance and technology. He held CFO positions in a number of major companies, including CSR, PLC, and Sky. He has a track record of creating value and building well-managed companies. And he has been a key architect of Drax purpose and strategy, driving the sustainability agenda from the top, including Drax's response to the climate change crisis and ensuring that the company is delivering for its stakeholders. He provides the leadership of the executive team and takes responsibility for external relationships and stakeholder management. Will, the floor is yours.
Very good. Thank you, Christian, and good morning, everybody. It's great to be here at COP26. It's I think the debate has already begun as to whether it's encouraging or disappointing. Lots of voices already on both sides. I think there are some encouraging signs. I mean, pledges to end deforestation, reduce methane leakage, and the funding of coal and phase that out. I think those are all promising signs. There are also signs of disappointment. Too bad that the Chinese, Russians, and others are not here, right? But I think for me, the ambition is becoming increasingly clear. I think the world, wants to solve this problem, and we're going to turn to the question of how do we do that, and that's a finance question, it's a technology question, and I think biomass has an important role to play there. I'd thought I might start. I mean, I'm not an energy industry veteran, although I've been at Drax for about 6 years now, so that might make me almost a veteran or getting there. And the last job I had was in a technology company, and I remember I was sort of between jobs, and I trying to figure out what I wanted to do next. And I got a call from a recruiter who sort of said, it was a rainy afternoon, I was sitting at my kitchen table, and she said, I have an interesting opportunity for you, Will. Would you like to work at a power station in Yorkshire? Right? To which I sort of, scratched my head a little bit, and I said, I'm not sure, let me think about it, right? So I went back and I did some research to try to understand what that was all about, and I started to discover what Drax had done. And this was in 2015. And 10 years before that, Drax had started this process of trying to figure out how it could live in a future without coal. Right? Because Drax is quite an unusual company, or was at that time. It was a single-site power station with no other business other than coal-fired power generation. So it was really an existential question for Drax as what they would do. Started out researching co-firing. I think at this point we've actually researched more than 300 different types of fuel. Ultimately made the decisions, probably when Amber was sort of running the show in the government, to go to 100% biomass, which actually is something that not that many companies even until today have actually done. We've now converted 4 of our 6 units from coal to biomass, and we run coal increasingly infrequently. We will close our coal completely in September of next year. Right? So Drax at its heyday was about 6% of the UK's energy mix, all coal. The largest single source of carbon emissions in Western Europe. Today, Drax is still about 6% of the UK's power generation, about 12% of its renewable power, and ultimately we've reduced our emissions by about 90%. Right? So for me, it's a major and positive decarbonization story for Europe. Right? Another thing I think is important to recognize is that one of the benefits of doing a biomass conversion, and I think as other countries are debating how to come off coal, is that actually a lot of the jobs that are there in that power station, in fact more jobs, will be there after the fact, right? And actually they are the same good quality jobs that were there at the coal-fired power station in the beginning, which is very much not the same for gas, wind, or solar. And there's additional benefits. I mean, we actually support about 6,000 jobs both in the power station but across the supply chain in Yorkshire. Right? So I think the transformation so far has been a big success, as both John and Amber have alluded to. But in fact, what really excites me now as we look forward is what is going to come next, right? And the opportunity for us actually, I think, at Drax is to play a major role in actually creating what I think is going to be a major new industry, which I would call the negative emissions industry, right? And if you look at what the IPCC calls for globally, or the Climate Change Committee calls for, in order to get to net zero, we're going to need to do as much as 10 billion tons of carbon removal per year by 2050, right? And 10 billion is obviously a very big number. In the UK, it's somewhere between 50 and 100 million, I should say, in the UK. So if we're going to get to so-called net zero, there are going to be sectors that are going to be difficult to decarbonize, and so we'll need something that is actually negative to offset those remaining emissions. But for me, more importantly, it's not just about getting to net zero, but we have our carbon budget, as it's called, is just shrinking all the time. I think, broadly speaking, the amount of the carbon budget that remains is about 500 gigatons. The total amount of emissions that we as a planet can have in order to stay within 1.5 degrees is about 500 billion tons, right? And the current rate of emissions is about 50 billion a year, right? So we've got about 10 years left at the current rate if we're going to get somewhere, right? And so for me, what we need to start doing is we need to start using every tool in the toolkit as fast as we possibly can to try to solve this problem. So what are we doing at Drax as it relates to BECCS, right? So what we will do is we will add carbon capture and storage onto the bioenergy power generation that we already have, right? So what does that mean? You sort of build an absorber column, you run the flue gas through that column, the CO2 is separated out, you then take that CO2, put it into a pipe, transport it over to the North Sea and store it a couple of kilometers underneath the North Sea bed, right? And that will deliver what I would call it's negative emissions. It's permanent geological CO2 removal, right? Which again I think has a major role to play. Right? all the things that we need to put that in place are sort of the three different strands that need to happen for this to work. The first one is we need the carbon capture and storage infrastructure, and the UK government is actively working on putting that in place. Right? They announced that they will support 2 priority CCS clusters back in the summer. One of them is the so-called East Coast Cluster, sort of the northeast of England, and we are part of that cluster. Right? So that work is underway. Right? Second thing that needs to happen is we need to have our technology and our design ready and finished. We've already trialed several different solvents at the Drax power station, and we know we can do this. And we will move into the next stage of that process, probably in the beginning of next year. Right? Both of those processes, the pipeline and our own technology, will lead to a sort of construction that could start at the beginning of 2024. Right? And the third thing, which I think is key to all of the things we need to do, is a partnership between government and industry to put in place the right regulatory framework to enable this to happen. Right? And the government has announced several things in the last several weeks. They've announced a net zero strategy that clearly defines a role for greenhouse gas removals in the UK for them to get to their net zero targets. They announced an interim bioenergy strategy last week, which again has clear steps in how they want to use bioenergy and BECCS to get to net zero. Clear call, for example, for strong sustainability standards. I think it's probably widely recognized that the UK has among the strongest sustainability standards in the world, and there's a call to look at those and see if they can be strengthened. We welcome that. Because there's no question that if this is not doing what it says on the tin, i.e. contributing to healthy and growing forests, it's not worth doing. Right? So all of that program is moving forward well. We would hope to start building in 2024, be ready to run in 2027. And I think if you look at it on a global scale, of that 10 billion tons of carbon removal that we talked about, again, we've done a bunch of work with a group called the Coalition for Negative Emissions, and we think that BECCS can do between 2 and 4 gigatons, or 2 to 4 billion of that total amount, right? And where does that number come from? That number is based on clear and strict sustainability limits. It says you can't go above that level, or if you do go above that level, basically it would not work, again, as I said before, it would not make any sense, right? So again, another reason why we call for very clear and strict global standards on sustainability, right? So final point I would make is what are we looking for next, right? And I think in order for the whole world of negative emissions, BECCS to take off as I think it needs to, we need to have very clear definitions that are widely accepted globally. What constitutes negative emissions, right? What are the ways that we will certify that? How will we verify it? What are the auditing standards going to be? And so that will, having all those pieces in place will enable actually these markets to take off. And again, we see encouraging signs. Right? So the UK, for example, called for in their net zero strategy, how do we actually enable negative emissions to be part of the UK's emissions trading scheme, right? So lots of work to be done, but I think very encouraging signs of progress, right? So thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Will. It's really impressive what Enviva, what Drax have been achieving, and I think at the end of the day, if we really want to manage this monumental task of changing our energy system, it's the private sector that needs to deliver. The question to you, Amber, is how can policymakers make that possible? What is their role?
Thank you, Christian. And it's been great to hear from both John and Will just now. And Will's point at the end there was about the UK sustainability criteria and wanting them to be ever improving, which is absolutely right. And it really reflects the fact that there is, of course, increasing requirements for transparency on what actually is taking place. And the truth is, different countries don't really have an agreed set of identification of what emissions are, and that needs to end. There needs to be much more clarity on what is taking place, what the emissions are, how we measure them, and of course coming back to Article 6 and carbon markets. And that really leads into my answer to your question, Christian, which is that for private sector investment, they need to know what they're getting, and they need to have confidence in it. And government policy is absolutely at the core of that. I mean, governments can do three things. They can tap on this area, any other areas. They can do lots of other things, some good, some bad. But they can, they can tax, they can give a subsidy, or they can do a policy change. And those are the three levers they have in terms of improving and increasing the change of our energy sources. And by far the most effective, and I suspect the gentleman would agree with me, is a policy change. Because a policy change gives certainty to the organisation and certainty to the private sector for that investment. And the one I would particularly highlight is banning the internal combustion engine, non-electric cars, basically, from 2030 and completely by 2035. And as an indication of the pace at which UK government has moved since Paris, it's really it's extraordinary. I mean, we wouldn't have thought it was going to happen in 2015 under a Conservative government that would be announced. And of course, now there is a rush to get the batteries in place, to get the EV chargers in place, to make sure that enough electric cars are going to be there. And even now, you can buy in China an electric car on Alibaba for $12,000. And those prices will start to come over to the West, to the UK, where at the moment people complain quite rightly they're jolly expensive electric cars. With a policy change like the one we've seen, that will start to change. And it feels that there is absolute commitment from this government and from the EU to try and make those policy changes, which will help to drive all those changes. The other thing just on finance I would say is finance will follow the policy because the opportunity's there, but there is also government policy which is requiring financial investments to be aligned with Paris. And that's why the Mark Carney announcement about 130 million aligned with Paris was so important. It's no longer going to be okay for asset managers to think they can stay out of this important change to our energy sources. It's bringing them into it, so they too have to participate, as well as the change in policies that's going to really make the changes and make the finance available.
Thank you, Amber. That was comprehensive. So, and it was encouraging too, because really looking around, things are changing, and slowly but surely the tides are actually changing and going towards renewables. John, let me ask you a question. I mean, we have been talking about the huge impact of decreasing carbon emissions here in Europe with the pellets that your company is supplying. But what is the other side of the supply chain? How did that impact the management of forests in the United States? Can you report a little bit about this?
Yes, Christian, absolutely. This is critical to everything we're talking about, right? Forests are such an important part of how we will mitigate climate change. And I think what you certainly have in the Southeast U.S. and why I think Amber's comments about regulations and transparency and certainty and commitments from governments who can regulate forestry and activities across their jurisdictions and provide transparency into exactly how trees are grown, why trees are grown, and just as importantly, why that forest can continue to grow. And that's really, one of the most fascinating things about the Southeast U.S. The Southeast United States is a forest landscape that provides about 20% of the world's forest products. This is largely a privately owned natural resource. So quite literally, millions and millions of family tree farmers that have owned and managed this land sustainably for generations. And so people own and grow trees because they are valuable, because there are markets for why that landowner would utilize that land for trees instead of soybeans or a parking lot. And so the decision to grow trees is a financial decision. It is a decision that a landowner makes and says, I believe that the markets for this tallest, straightest timber that becomes a telephone pole or dimensional lumber or furniture, things that are permanent, semi-permanent carbon storage, really valuable. But the byproducts of that, the tops, the limbs, the understory that comes along with well-managed land, otherwise doesn't have a market absent something like bioenergy. And so although it may be a small fraction of the value, maybe 10% of the value of a harvest, it can be as much as 30% of the volume. And if people like Enviva weren't there, that would be pushed up into the middle of the land and burned. If you fly over the southeast U.S. on any day, you can see burn piles. That is zero utility to the amazing natural resource that we have. So how does this work, right? No one grows a tree for Enviva. People grow trees for that tallest, straightest timber. And as part of that merchandising activity that occurs on every forest stand, that high-value wood goes to the sawmills. The very, very low-value wood for which our payment price is roughly 10% of the equivalent top-line value, that's what we take. And we upgrade it, we process it, we terminal it, and we distribute it around the world, serving a global supply chain. So what is the landowner response to this, right? This is a resource that every single year across the southeast U.S., landowners grow about 1.7 times as much as is harvested. Right? That's not new. That's the story of the southeast U.S. for the last 200 years. It's why forest inventories have more than doubled since 1953 with about the same land area. So what happens in areas where people like Enviva operate? In the 10 years that we've operated in the southeast U.S., inside of the areas where we operate, 400 million tons of wood fiber has grown in excess of when we started. So there's more, not less, than when we started. There's more. Why is that? Because markets matter. When there's a product that a farmer can understand and say, I have visibility into why I'm going to grow this tree, they grow more trees. So when we say we displace coal, we grow more trees, this is the story of how we fight climate change.
That's a very good story. Thank you. That's a very good story and very important explanation, because very often people might think harvesting trees means killing forests, but the opposite is the case. So looking at this, looking at what has been accomplished, looking at the positive impacts, I'm wondering, whenever people are talking about renewables, they're talking about wind, they're talking about solar, why don't they talk about bioenergy? Do you have an explanation for that?
I'll give it a try. No, I think for me it's useful to go back. Again, I'll go back to when I started at Drax and I was at Paris in 2015, and the story then was, let's aim for this 2-degree target, right? But when people set that target, I don't think there was a very good sense. I know there was not a very good sense of how that would happen, right? And one of the things that's sort of amazing to me is if you think back, it's only 6 years ago, that all the work that's been done in that time, sort of by scientific bodies, businesses, governments, to actually design pathways for how the world would get to net zero and how the world would try to limit climate change to 1.5 or 2 degrees, right? And a lot of that work has started in the energy sector. And the question was, well, first let's decarbonize energy, then we'll use that zero carbon power to decarbonize automotive sector, we'll use that to decarbonize heat, et cetera, right? So, and I would say now the pathways are quite clear, right? But if you go back to that pathway for the energy sector globally, one of the things again that's happened is that when we started that, 6 or 7 years ago, the price or the cost of wind and solar was still quite high, right? And people didn't, I don't think, at the beginning have that much confidence that they would actually become cheaper than fossil fuels and that they would actually be the majority source of power that we would have, right? And what's happened is that they've dramatically reduced in price. And so actually in today's world, the lowest cost form of new generation pretty much everywhere is going to be either wind or solar, right? And so it's absolutely fair and right that they should be the sort of the major sort of sources of energy or the major sort of stars of what people see as the sort of transition to renewable power. But as John has, I think, rightly pointed out, and they're not always there, right? So the wind does not always blow, the sun does not always shine, and you're going to need something to run when they're not running, right? Now, and different countries will have different sets of problems, right? So if you're in Saudi Arabia, for example, you have a night versus day problem, right? So you've got lots of solar power in the day, and you have none, obviously, at night. So that's a 12-hour, let's say, battery storage or storage problem, right? And that might be something you can manage with batteries, right? But in large parts of the world, and I'll take Western Europe as a good example, the so-called sort of the lack of sun, or what you might call a wind drought, is going to potentially last a lot longer than that, right? So if you go back to September, very unusual in the UK, this past September, We had a period when there was not a lot of, I would say, conventional generation around. A lot of the conventional power stations were on outages, and the wind was not blowing at all, right? And unfortunately, there was nothing there to support the system. The biomass was running full out, and we actually had to run coal as a country, right? But that piece where you basically say there's no wind, there's no sun, that's where bioenergy can play a critical role, right? And I think, Amber gave the number 6%. Biomass, I would say over the course of a year in the UK, as I said before, Drax is about 12% of the renewable power. Overall biomass probably around 15. And I think that's a fair sort of number, what you could expect in the UK over the longer term, because it will again be a very good source of that sort of system stability, peaking power, other forms of ancillary services. And as I talked about before, it has this incredible advantage of being able to also take CO2 out of the atmosphere, right? So the opportunity to have negative emissions makes it, again, unique. And not only is it unique for that, but it's also the only form of negative emissions that also provides power, right? So again, I think there's an enduring role there, but it will be one which is not going to be the big one, which will be solar and wind, but a critical one in that sort of 20% kind of range.
Christian,
Yes.
can I add something to that?
Please do that.
Will, you're spot on. And in my prepared remarks, we talked about the intermittency challenges and the as available. What I think that we're also seeing globally is the role that biomass has in heat generation, right? So heat also very difficult to generate with solar and wind, right? And particularly in the industrial sector, right? So industrial actors not only need the as available always on, but they have actually quite intense heat loads. Process manufacturing is not just the energy component in their supply chain, it's actually the direct input to their manufacture of a commodity. So think about heat in steel making. You can't make steel with wind, right? That's a challenge. And the world is going to continue to need steel. They're going to continue to need cement. They're going to continue to need things like lime and chemicals. And if you can not just influence the energy component of that supply chain and that manufacturing supply chain, but if you can actually displace fossil carbons in the manufacture of those products, you can make green steel. You can make green chemicals. You can make green aviation fuel. These are very, very difficult problems to solve historically, but biomass is becoming an increasingly important part of the conversation, not just for the energy transition, but really in difficult to abate industries and really those that require quite deep decarbonization.
Thanks for adding that. I would like to come back a little bit to the BECCS topic, and I would like to ask you, Amber. I mean, I recall your prime minister said keep the bills low, but doing BECCS is actually adding costs. Do you see that the UK is really willing to pioneer this? Because you have been pioneering the electricity generation from biomass. Are you going to be the pioneer in BECCS?
Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, it's certainly the case that the politics of this has changed. Will obviously had the same experience as I did in Paris, which is that it was great. There was a big push, but it was nothing like the kind of committed certainty that there is now about trying to do this. And obviously the reason for that is that the science is stark and the public can see what dangerous climate change is with droughts and floods around us. So I think it has all changed. In 2015, the UK had a carbon capture and storage program, which unfortunately got a red line put through it in order to save £1 billion on the budget. Now, I know that those days are over, and the evidence is that the UK has been very committed over the past few years. We'll refer to the carbon capture and storage clusters. 2 have just been given seed funding, and there is no question that in order to deliver on this, we have to have carbon capture and storage. And the IPCC report, which is, as we know, the Bible of what's actually going to happen, has said that we have to have carbon capture and storage, and actually has a BECCS type equivalent as I find a disarmingly large part of the need in order to achieve the net zero targets that we've got. So yes, the UK is committed to this. We're seeing the evidence in policy and finance, and the science shows that we have to have it.
Sounds good to me. Will?
Sounds good to me too. No, just to follow up on that, just a little bit of a discussion about the cost and how this, in my view, how it might evolve over time. So, what does it cost, or what do we think it will cost us to capture the carbon and to sort of generate the power in a BECCS unit, right? So, roughly speaking, it's about 150 pounds to create 1 megawatt hour of power and capture 1 ton of CO2, right? Now, how does that compare to those prices of those commodities in the market today? Well, the price of power in the UK, a megawatt hour, is well above 100, right? It's actually about 200, right? Now that's hopefully not a long-term number, but on a long-term basis, people think the power price in the UK might be around, let's say, 60 pounds per megawatt hour. Eh? What's the price of carbon in the UK? The price of carbon today in the UK, or the cost of it, is roughly 70 pounds, right? So 70 and 60, 130. So if we're at 150, we're not very far off, right? Now what those two numbers...
Good morning, all COP delegates.
Guess he doesn't agree. I don't know.
Let me remind you to wear your face mask over your mouth and nose at all times. During your time in the conference, unless you are seated in a room with appropriate distance, or whilst eating or drinking, or are medically exempt. Thank you for your cooperation.
Very good. Thank you for that reminder. But if you take that, let's say 150 that I talked about, the 130, which might be the market prices today of those two commodities, that clearly doesn't give you long-term certainty, right? And to make a £1 or £2 billion investment that we would like to make, we would need some of that, right? So the interesting thing again in the UK is that we have a very clear precedent in terms of a policy instrument that we can use for that, right? So the CFD structures that have been massively supportive of biomass, but probably more well-known in how they've supported the development of offshore wind, is exactly what we would like to ask for, right? So if you have a long-term contract, government gives you a guaranteed price, that's what you get on the first one, then we do a second one, price should come down over time as the technology improves, and it's been a very effective way, and Amber probably designed it, I would guess, huh?
I'd like to take the credit, Will, so thank you.
It actually is a very effective way of developing these new technologies, and we think that could work for BECCS.
The bit I will point out, where Will is absolutely right, really, is that when we lost the fight from my department from carbon capture and storage in 2015, we only won the fight for offshore wind by agreeing to very testing targets for the price. And in fact, the offshore wind industry at that time said it can't be done. And I've spoken to a lot of them since then, and they actually didn't believe it could be done. But the scale of it meant that the economies of scale clicked in, as it became a very successful industrial policy, really, and the price came down by more than half and continues to come down, but it won't come down at that scale again. And I think it would be absolutely the right method to do it, to hopefully bring down the price with carbon capture and storage as well.
Just one more question to John before we ask for questions from the audience. John, now we're talking about really large scaling bioenergy use in an unprecedented way. How can we ensure that this is not going to get into conflict with sustainability? How can we make sure that there is a proper monitoring and a transparent use of bioenergy that makes sure that we don't see unsustainable use? What's your point on that?
No, fantastic question, Christian. This is, again, at the very heart of what we do as an industry and as a society committed to fighting climate change. And I think Amber said it right. We talked a little bit about the importance of the rule of law, and so strict enforcement of laws and commitments to sustainability. And so what does that really mean? So when we talked about the forests of the Southeast U.S., we talked about the importance of how those forests are healthy and growing and increasing carbon sinks at the same time as we are creating utility in the forest product sector, of which bioenergy is frankly a very small part. But this is exactly the dynamic that the UN IPCC is calling for in terms of a holistic cycle where forests, of course, absorb carbon during their life cycle permanently or semi-permanently store that in things like dimensional lumber, furniture, and the like, and then the byproducts of which become substitutions for fossil fuels. But the critical point there is sustainable forestry. So are forests continuing to grow after taking account of all of the activities within those? And if you can certify and document and third-party audit, maintain certifications, and publish and report against that transparency, then you know what? Things like RED 2 actually got it right. So the Renewable Energy Directive 2 and its sustainability criteria, which reasonably closely approximates the UK's, which I would also characterize as leading, so long as we can maintain stable or growing carbon stocks in forests, I think we're on the right path. And the moment we deviate from that, we need to have strict enforcement and consequences. That's why for Enviva, it is a criterion to supply wood fiber to us that that land is replanted. You cannot be a supplier of wood fiber to us if you haven't contractually agreed to replant your land. And you know what we do? We track and we trace every single ton of wood fiber that comes into our supply chain, and we publish it transparently on our website and audit it by third parties.
So I can look on your website where you are harvesting the wood is being harvested?
Every single dot on the website.
Every single dot, all right. Yeah. So that is transparency at its best, I would say. That's transparency at its best. Okay, let's look for questions from the audience. Please state your name and your affiliation and just ask a short question, not too long. Please, go ahead. There is a microphone. Please use the mic.
Thank you. Mark Sommerfeld from the REA, the Association for Renewable Energy and Clean Technologies. One of the first very big announcements at this conference was about forestry and ending deforestation. What role does the biomass industry have in helping countries deliver that commitment?
Maybe I'll go ahead and start, but the trees are grown because they are valuable. And so the opportunity, and across not just the Southeast U.S., but I would say the forest landscapes generally, incentives to grow trees really matter. Private market incentives have proven historically the most effective means of doing so. But the world will continue to need the resources made available from trees. And so ensuring that those trees are planted with sustainable forestry in mind, that markets exist for the products of ultimately what those trees mature and become, is really, really important. And managing, measuring, and monitoring is equally important. So as we think about why deforestation happens, well, land use change generally is driven by a competing priority for that land. And so if we can create the right incentive mechanism for people to continue to grow trees, they will continue to do so. That's the story of the Southeast U.S., and one that I think can be replicated and exported around the world.
I might add that is, of course, also the story of forestry in Europe. Forestry in Europe is absolutely sustainable. We are harvesting about 60% of the regrowth. For the time being, the area of forest is constantly increasing in Europe. It's not decreasing, it's increasing, because a lot of grazing pastures are being converted into forests, or have been converted over the last 30 years. So that definitely is also part of the story. Please, Will and Amber.
No, the one thing I was going to add is I think that there's the debate about biomass often tends to sort of be quite narrow, and it sort of discusses, is biomass a good or a bad idea, right? And I actually think that the debate needs to be moved, and we need to be thinking more about forest management and the role that biomass plays in that topic. And so again, I think there's an opportunity here as the UK looks at its standards for sustainability and how it requires us to source fiber, as John's pointed out, and what the rules are for the forest management behind that actually we take that broader, right? Maybe we take that broader, not just a UK requirement, we extend it to Europe, extend it more globally. And also maybe it's not just about biomass, it's about how the forest is managed in a more general sense to make sure that actually the rules it's not just about how we manage it, it's about how the forest owners manage it so that actually they're supplying all the different industries that are dependent on fiber. So we are very much supportive of adding and increasing and having a better dialogue around that ultimately ends up with some sort of, I think, more global standard. Right?
Can I ask a question? Thank you. There's a very famous book by David Mackay, Renewable Energy Without the Hot Air. And it's for interested people, it's a kind of starter on the requirement for intense energy production. It's about the intensity content of energy. And in it, he talks about the space that is needed to deliver solar and wind. And this was before solar and wind became quite so productive as they've become. And David Mackay, sadly, is no longer with us. But he made some extraordinary parallels showing how if you really thought you wanted so much solar, you'd have to have a country bigger than the UK just to power half of the UK type thing. And so my ask of Will and John is, this IPCC report, which talks about these high levels of BECCS, basically. Some of the criticism of it is that you'd need a country twice the size of India. What is the answer to that, please?
Why don't I start on that, because we've done a lot of work on this question, because when we sort of the number I gave you guys before, which is that we think BECCS can do or can take between 2 and 4 gigatons of CO2 out of the atmosphere. The way we came up with that, or the way that analysis was done, is it said if you take, all of the sort of forests that are managed forests, that are commercial forests, and you have the regular harvests as they are done now, and you use the residuals from those harvests, the way John sort of described it, and you stick with the sustainability criteria that we have today, and you avoid places which have risk of biodiversity, you avoid countries that are, do not have the right governance that you need. I mean, that's where that number comes from, right? So that number is also, I think, less than half of the IPCC number, right? I mean, I think the IPCC number is much higher. So, I mean, my own view is that we should have strict standards. We should keep them low. We should stick with the type of framework that we have today that has proven to work. And I think we should set those limits, right? So as part of this idea of having a sort of a more global standard around biomass, part of it should be that type of thing, right? And why? Because I think one of the reasons I think that there's a lot of nervousness around biomass or straight opposition is exactly that reason, right? I mean, people are worried that it gets to be too big, and I would be the first to say it shouldn't be. I mean, because if it doesn't do what it says on the tin, it doesn't make any sense, right?
Well,
but,
I would like to. Sorry.
Let me add, Amber. This is. David was very, very thoughtful in his preparation of this, because what you actually see is that these incentives have oftentimes unintended consequences. So when you think about solar incentives, for instance, and solar, we would all acknowledge one of the most critical forms of energy generation to facilitate the energy transition. Well, in North Carolina, one of the leading causes of forest loss is conversion to solar farms. So you're cutting down a strand of trees to build a solar farm. That's challenging. That's challenging. Now, the scale question is one that is really important as well. And what you would hear from Enviva is the same as Drax, that mindful of the sustainability approach is essential. But the reality of the forest in the Southeast U.S., that 20% of the world's forest products, only 3% of the forest landscape in the Southeast U.S. is harvested in any given year. 3%. So 3% generates 20% of the world's forest products. Of that 3%, only 2% of that 3% goes to someone like me. And you might remember in our prepared remarks, we described the regrowth dynamic. Yes. So 1.7 tons is regrown in its place for every one of those tons that is harvested for any use. It's remarkable. So
the opposite, the shorthand response to the twice the size of India is it doesn't take account of regrowth.
Well, I think the advances in silviculture and what you see in the experience of the Southeast U.S., where the forest landscape has produced twice the amount of standing timber in the last 50 plus years on the same acreage, is evidence that incentives matter. And if we put our minds to it, we will do it.
Let me add one aspect, and that is we're only talking about forests now, but the world also has other forms of biomass. Let's just think about the residues from harvesting wheat or corn or all kinds of sugar cane. There is an abundance of biomass available, and the International Energy Agency has noted that in their scenario for 2050, basically half of what is going to be used for bioenergy will be these agricultural residues. So there is a huge potential development in these fields. They're technically much more challenging, so you don't like to have them in your power plant. You do. Okay, that's good. Good. But it's not easy because they are corrosive and they can mess up your power plant. So you have to be very careful about it. But there is still a pile of other possibilities that we have to look on and that we are going to look on, and we need the technology still to develop these. But that is another possibility. Please.
Thank you very much. My name is Zoltán Kun. I came from Griffith University and Wild Europe. you may allow 3 questions because we have 3 speakers. First is the 2 gentlemen spoke about decarbonization, but the kids outside who were protesting for 2 days, I think it's hard to explain to them that if I burn a tree, that's carbon neutral, because there is carbon in the tree. So how, in a given time frame, how do you think this could become carbon neutral, especially because your website says that the average year of harvesting the timber in Southeast US is 34 years, and we have 29 here until 2050 in Europe. The other question is policy certainty. You mentioned this is an important element, and Zach Goldsmith a few days ago said that there are real problems with burning of wood pellets for energy in the Telegraph. And he says that this should be considered. And the last is to you, though. You were not a speaker, but you said there is sustainability in Europe with forest. Let me remind you that the European Environmental Agency said that only 14% of the forest habitats in Europe are in good conservation status. Sustainability has 3 elements: social, economic, and ecological. It seems that the European forests are not in a good state from an ecological point of view. So if you can comment these 3 points, I would like. Thanks.
Christian, can I go ahead and start?
Yeah, good.
Yeah, so thank you very much for the question. I think when you examine the forests, and I'll speak with respect to the Southeast U.S. again, so those forests are all in various stages. Every single tract of land is in its own phase of growth, harvest, or regrowth, replanting. And so, as I mentioned, only about 3% of the forest landscape is touched on an annual basis. So 97% of that is growing robustly, right? Generating that amazing regrowth that sequesters carbon during its life cycle. So at the landscape level, what the UN framework for carbon accounting has been very, very clear about is that they're going to count those carbon emissions within the forest sector. And I think you're very well familiar with the land use and land use change in forestry, which measures carbon stocks at the forest landscape level, which is why the forests of the Southeast, like other fiber basins in the world, are such amazing carbon sinks. And so long as we maintain that stable and growing carbon stocks, then the resource, whether it's bioenergy or dimensional lumber, that resource in and of itself is carbon neutral because it has absorbed all that carbon during its life. And again, it grows every single year at an amazing, robust rate because people continue to invest in owning and growing trees.
You've been asking me about the ecological aspect. And yes, indeed. I mean, forestry for a couple of decades has been too much focused on single species. That has led to decline in biodiversity in the forests in Europe. And we can see a very clear sign that this is changing now because these monocultures of pine or spruce, they are starting to get really strongly affected by climate change and by insect and pest events that are destroying large parts of the forest. Now, what is the consequence? The consequence is we need to change the type of forest that we have to become more resilient also to climate change, which means we need to use the trees that are out there and replace them with different trees. So the issue that you're mentioning is a serious issue, but the consequence of this issue is not don't touch the forest. The consequence is manage the forests in a way that makes room for more biodiversity and that increases the stability of the forest. Now, let me also add something to this question of a tree needs 40 years to grow, and so if we kill a tree now, it'll be not replaced within 40 years. In Austria, my home country, we have a daily growth of 100,000 cubic meters of wood. The forest is growing 100,000 cubic meters every day. So if I harvest today 100,000 cubic meters, it does not take 38 years or 70 years or 80 years till these are replaced. It takes only one day. It's going to be tomorrow. Tomorrow, the same amount of wood will be standing in the forest as today, regardless to the fact that I have been harvesting 100,000 cubic meters. I think that's the the mindset you need to have to understand forest carbon. Was there a certain, what was the cert? Amber?
Just one comment on Zach Goldsmith's comments is that the industry has to take the challenge every day to reassure people about forest. And Christian's made that point, and Zach has a long track record of being absolutely on top of making sure that biodiversity in this planet continues to thrive, and has fought very hard to make nature as part of the debate we've been having over the past 2 weeks. So it will fall to the industry to continually reassure skeptics or people who oppose it that it's thinking about these things and can show that the sustainability criteria that the UK has, that it's now reviewing to make stronger, are going to deliver and reassure people.
No, I would just echo that. I mean, my comments before about having clear sustainability criteria that the government puts in place and that we have to live up to is absolutely what we're up for, right? And I look forward to talking with Zach Goldsmith about what are the issues that he sees that we have with bioenergy, so we can actually work on them, right? I mean, the only way to do this is to have a good dialogue. And maybe the final point I would make is that the biomass industry tends to be, as I sort of mentioned before, sort of conflated with every forest use, right? And when you're sort of harvesting in Austria that 100,000 cubic meters, I mean, as John said, 80% of, most of that harvest is going to make furniture, houses, and all the rest of it. And what we're using is a byproduct of that process, right? So the options for that byproduct are, you can leave it in the forest, you can burn it, it's going to degrade rapidly anyway. So making power out of it instead of using coal to do the same, I think makes a lot of sense.
Yes, please. 2 more questions. Please wait for the microphone.
Hi, I am Alejandra. I am from Peru, and I'm an energy engineering student. And I would like to ask you, in developing countries where waste management is really a big issue, and on the other side, we have huge potential of agricultural waste and organic fraction of municipal waste. What policy recommendations would you give to these developing countries to start pushing bioenergy, power generation, and talking about that this problem of agricultural waste and organic fraction of municipal waste is being talked about, and it actually creates a lot of emissions, and kind of these technologies also thinking about biogas generation. How could this be developed in these countries?
Well, I'm afraid I can't talk about it with the expertise of a former policymaker, but what I can tell you is it's a great question for a day where this conference is focused on science. Because the technical advancements that have emerged even in the last 5 years related to waste management and processing and capabilities has unlocked an amazing new potential of solutions. And so I think where policymaking might provide some really important attributes is providing the direct incentive and certainty for doing something different with whatever that the agricultural or waste stream was. And so you begin to see, and I'll analogize the United States for a moment, which is the renewable natural gas industry. So things that started on methane capture out of landfills have now evolved to a spot where, with relatively high efficiency, whether it's agricultural activities like chicken farming, all the way through to waste digesting activities, they're now in a position to upgrade what had been a relatively difficult to process gas stream into pipeline quality renewable natural gas, all produced on the basis of not extracting fossil fuel molecules, but creating that exact same molecule that can be utilized as a drop-in substitute. And we've actually just last week announced a quite large transaction where we're actually procuring renewable natural gas for sort of part of our process in our facilities. Really fantastic, but it did require a policy-making framework that provided an incentive to do something different than what was being done that day.
Just to endorse that and to say it has to be, countries either tax, they subsidize, or they create policy. I.e. policy demands. So you tell the electricity companies that you have to do 30% renewable, then they will start to find it. So there has to be some sort of policy in place in order to drive that.
There's also, sorry about that. There is also know-how associated with these new technologies, and like we in the World Bioenergy Association, for example, looking now at technologies to use agricultural waste as a base for producing pellets for clean cook stoves, and that could hugely impact the situation in poor countries, because they are offering very clean energy, almost as clean as burning with LPG, for example, at a much lower price. So the countries can afford it, the people can afford it, and it utilizes unutilized agricultural residues. So there are very interesting possibilities also for developing countries.
All right, the only thing I was going to add is I think in some ways, that sort of to Amber's point, subsidizing, I think there are good models for that. I think taxing, good models for that. I think the governance around sustainability is probably the hardest thing, right? Because really, I mean, getting it right so that actually you can be confident that what is being used is actually agricultural residue, is waste, and is done in a sustainable way. And again, I think looking to models, right? I think the UK has got some pretty good models for all those things. What would be, at least a useful place to start.
One last question here, just in front of you, please.
Hello. My name is Vera O'Riordan, and I'm a researcher with the Marine and Renewable Energy Institute, University College Cork, Ireland. And in my country, there's a lot of quite small, medium-sized dairy and beef farms. Some of them not very productive, not very profitable. And my question for all of you is, from a policy perspective, how do we encourage small farmers and medium farmers, maybe not with a lot of access to startup investment or income, to make that leap to change the business model of their farms from a very, methane-intensive dairy and beef farming and take on, tillage, take on forestry for biofuels, forestry for land protection itself? How do we encourage that switch in land use and that complete change in practices?
Just a couple ideas. And this is, apologies, this is more UK relevant, maybe less than Ireland because of Brexit.
A lot in common.
Yeah. No, but one of the things, we actually announced in September work we're going to do with the National Farmers Union here in the UK to think about how we can, incentivize, sort of create the right system for more energy crops. Right? I think the UK has a pretty unique scenario right now, which is coming out of the EU, and as a result, it needs to put in place a new system for supporting sort of agriculture and the rural economy. And one way to do that could be to encourage energy crops, right? So again, I think the government has a huge role to play in this, and I think energy crops is an interesting one because it lots of challenges. What is it replacing? Is it a good thing that it replaces? Is it not a good thing to replace? It's so, a lot of complexity. But I think, energy crops, if you can support those as a way of actually lowering the cost of generating power from biomass in a way that actually supports farming, I think there could be a good combination there.
Yeah, it's such a good point. How do we get these large policies down to smaller deliverers? And it's the same problem with small businesses as it is, of course, with smaller farmers. And the way to do it is to have the trade organisation, which would be the Irish Farmers Union of some sort, to help to design something with the government and add some subsidy incentive to it so that it's financially viable for them to make that transition and then to take off and do it on their own. So always with small organisations or individuals, the thing is always to work through the big collective that represents them, because those are the people that governments will engage with in order to design the optimum system.
Thank you, Amber. I think it's time to slowly wrap it up. Let me ask the three of you one final question. What is the one thing you can think of that is needed to unlock the potential of sustainable bioenergy to bridge the gap that we are seeing in climate protection? One strong thing that really would make a difference. Let's start over there.
For me, bioenergy, the future of it includes carbon capture, so BECCS is absolutely critical. I think when we have the first project underway and demonstrates that it works, that will unlock things. So getting that first project off the ground and running, I think will be a huge catalyst because there's too many people think there are too many unanswered questions, and when it's actually going, I think we'll get past that hurdle, and that will help things take off.
Christian, the word I would use is urgency. We do not have too much time. We cannot waste. We must move quickly with solutions that are available today, because the trend is in the wrong direction right now. We have the ability to displace coal and grow more trees, so let's go do it.
My answer is strong policy signals so that the money can flow and really build this area.
Lovely. Thank you all. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, participants. I'm very glad you attended this meeting here. We will be here for another 30 minutes for bilateral talks. We'll be happy to continue this conversation, and this meeting is closed. Thank you.